Very much for your testimony today. And Mr. Van Valkenburg, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Peter Van Valkenburg, the Director of Research at Coin Center, an independent nonprofit focused on the public policy questions raised by digital currencies and open blockchain networks. I'm going to explain open blockchain networks and then suggest why we need a unified federal approach to regulating some businesses in this space, while also offering a safe harbor to other businesses. Open blockchain networks allow connected computers to reach a trustworthy agreement over shared data. The connected computers can be owned by anyone in the world. The shared data could be a ledger of digital currency ownership or any other data for which widespread agreement and auditability are essential. Notable open blockchain networks include the original Bitcoin network for electronic cash, as well as follow-on innovations such as Ethereum for smart contracts and Zcash for privacy. Open blockchain networks are permissionless. There's no patent or copyright to license, no university or corporation from which to seek a job, no exclusive membership fee to pay. Anyone with a computer or smartphone and an internet connection can use these technologies and even can help build them. Just as the PC democratized computing and the web democratized news and entertainment, open blockchain networks are democratizing financial services. This innovation is inevitable. What remains undetermined is whether America will remain a home for permissionless innovation, as a venture capitalist might ask, and whether there will be responsible innovation, as a regulator might ask. Those aspirations are not irreconcilable, but they are also not guaranteed. America pioneered home computing and the internet in part because of our deep cultural and constitutional reverence for free speech, but also because of two laws passed by Congress in the late 1990s, the Communications Decency Act and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Both laws created safe harbors for infrastructure building businesses. They protected companies that were building the new information superhighways from third-party liability stemming from the actions of users on those highways. These safe harbors made the US a friendly home for the leaders of the internet revolution. But today, we are following, not leading. A young innovator dreaming of building the future of financial infrastructure would be best advised to leave the US. Not because she can do it on the cheap in a foreign jurisdiction that will look the other way, but simply because instead, determining what the US regulatory landscape demands of her is a Herculean undertaking. Indeed, between 53 states and territories and several independent federal regulators, it's a task that would be much simpler if she was in the United Kingdom and could ask one regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, for an opinion. In order to reestablish the US as a leader, we need to rationalize the chaos of financial services regulation, starting with state-by-state money transmission licensing. Custodial businesses should be regulated, but they should not need to repeat a licensing process 53 times over. These businesses are, by virtue of the internet, interstate in their scope of operations, and they should have similarly scoped regulators to avoid costly compliance redundancies and guarantee uniform consumer protection. Congress should encourage the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency to offer federal fintech charters to custodial digital currency firms. And Congress should also consider the creation of a new federal money transmission license as an alternative to state-by-state licensing. We also need a safe harbor. In several states, the definition of money transmission is broad and can be interpreted to require that non-custodial developers of the technology be licensed. It is not reasonable to mandate licensure from a technologist who helps build the networks, but is not holding consumer valuables. That's like trying to stop speeding by requiring costly licensing for highway construction personnel. It doesn't make sense, and it'll only mean that fewer highways get built. But amending overbroad laws in every state is not a scalable approach. The Commerce Clause empowers Congress to fix this problem. Much as it did in the 1990s for internet infrastructure, Congress should craft a federal blockchain safe harbor for non-custodial developers. Open blockchain networks are the pipes for our future economy. We want this infrastructure built here without unnecessary impediment and with reasonable protections for consumers. Innovation can be both permissionless and responsible, but it will only happen in the US if we take a unified national approach to regulating custodians and create a safe harbor for non-custodial developers. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Valkenburg, your group has focused on the blockchain technologies or the distributed ledger technologies. Will you give us, give the subcommittee some of the insights into what you think are on the horizon for the industry in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are young technologies, and as I said in my opening statement, they are fundamental infrastructure. They're pipes. So many of the consumer-facing apps are still in their infancy, and this is why I think we still see fairly little actual consumer adoption from normal Americans. However, what excites us most about the industry is that this infrastructure is open for others to build applications on top of. So for example, a company could build an app that facilitates international remittances. The company designs the user interface so that it's friendly, it's useful, it's compliant with KYC requirements, and has consumer protections baked in, as my colleague suggested. But rather than moving the money between the users via correspondent banking systems, the app uses digital currency to move value between the sender and the recipient. Now, the value moves faster in that system, an hour instead of 3 or more days, and the fees are potentially lower because there are not multiple correspondent banks in between. And there's 2 things that are important to point out in that hypothetical. One is that the technology made the application more friendly for the user, lower fees, a smartphone application that makes sense to them. But second, that the technology, the open blockchain network, made it easier for the business to get started. It lowered the barriers to entry for competition. Because previously they would have had to establish a banking relationship or multiple banking relationships with correspondent banks and several branch locations. But now they can simply build their consumer-facing app on top of existing open blockchain infrastructure and smartphones. One role that the CFPB has already played is enforcing unfair and deceptive and potentially abusive acts and practices. This is a logical way, potentially, to regulate some of the entities in this space because it's an ex post regulatory scheme rather than an ex ante. Our chief bugaboo, if you will, is the fact that companies need to get licensed in several states before operating, not necessarily that there aren't adequate watchdogs who can police their behavior once they're running. As far as creating a federal hub for regulation, we are agnostic as to which agency takes on that authority. What we primarily want to see is coordination between the agencies, because as I remarked, things are much simpler in more unified governments like in the United Kingdom, where there's one point agency, the Financial Conduct Authority, that does all regulation.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Van Valkenburg, Coin Center testified before this committee last Congress when we took a look at digital currency and blockchain technology. What can you tell us about how the landscape has changed for that technology in the last year? And we heard a lot about potential applications. Can you tell us about where you see the most promise in the short term?
Thank you, Congressman. I think the biggest change has been the emergence of several new networks based off of the original Bitcoin open blockchain technology. For example, I mentioned in my opening remarks Ethereum, which is a decentralized network for creating smart contracts. Smart contracts are a fancy word basically for more programmatic flows of funds through these networks. With Bitcoin, a transaction normally looks like I paid Mr. Chairman some Bitcoin. With a smart contract, we could give each of you a device, have that device provision you with a key of sorts, like a password, and quite literally have you vote on the flow of funds through the network. And unless somebody can penetrate each one of your devices and make you vote against your will, the movement of funds will have fidelity with your opinions when you make that vote. That is a fantastic innovation. It exists to some extent in Bitcoin under the name multi-sig transactions, multiple signatures from multiple people who are voting on the movement of funds. Ethereum makes programming those smart contracts even easier, so you can imagine even more complicated decentralized applications being built by supremely bright people on top of those networks. Additionally, Bitcoin is a very transparent network. It's not very private because all of the transactions are fully auditable on the blockchain. Another innovation that's recently emerged is a technology called Zcash, built on scientific research that allows for more private but still fully verifiable blockchains. That's also very exciting. The only thing I would add is that the user interface matters a great deal with technology. Google was actually the 15th search engine thereabouts. There were several that tried to make the web accessible to people and help them find the information they wanted, but simply didn't make it intuitive. It just didn't make sense to people when they tried to use it. Rapidly prototyping and the ability of new people to come in with a fresh idea of how to get people excited about their financial futures is very important. And to the extent that open blockchain networks create infrastructure that they can build on top of, minimizing the costs of trying something new, I think we'll see much more rapid consumer adoption of these new tools because they'll suddenly make sense when they're finally built by the right people who had the right vision.
Yeah. Could you give some examples of how often is a bank account needed to participate in these technologies? Bank account as in traditional bank account.
Especially in the digital currency and open blockchain space, despite the fact that the technology I described in some ways supplants the correspondent banking system, there will still be a need to on-ramp people into these new digital currency networks. So it will be very common for the company to have banking relationships that they process payments for, and it will be necessary for the user to have a bank account that they can connect in order to exchange their dollars for digital currency. Unfortunately, many of the companies that are working in this very exciting space have had trouble getting and maintaining banking relationships because they're seen as a money laundering risk. That is, despite the fact that all of the companies operating in the US as exchanges are fully registered and compliant with anti-money laundering requirements from FinCEN. I think there is a bit of a cultural problem here where perhaps examiners look at this as a fringe technology that should simply be ignored, and banks take a de-risking approach. I think that approach may be misguided because we want these companies in the regulatory system, because if these technologies exist outside of the regulatory system, we'll simply have less information about what people are doing with them, and will not allow them to flourish as hubs for innovation in these services.
Okay. Well, Mr. Van Valkenburg, how do you open blockchain networks, how does open blockchain networks encourage financial inclusion and diversity in the financial marketplace?
So the primary mechanism, I think, is allowing for the rapid prototyping of new tools that can be intuitive for users and meet their goals. So transactions can be faster when their back end is running through an open blockchain network. It can be cheaper for the customer, and it can also be cheaper for the business to try new approaches. So I think in that competition, you find more likely there will be an emergence of apps and services that speak to underserved communities, make them want to use those technologies, and make it easier for them to use those technologies safely.
But what are the issues and trends that we in Congress need to watch for to ensure that consumers benefit from innovation in a responsible and a secure way? Because it sounds like developing the regulatory framework can obviously be a huge challenge, but this access to the financial account is very serious and should be treated as such. So I'd appreciate all your thoughts. We'll start with you, sir.
So I think the key distinction to be made is between technologists who are building these technologies and holding other people's value, playing that custodial role, and technologists who are simply building the future infrastructure, really the pipes for the future economy. Making that distinction is key because I think you're absolutely right that we need a unified approach to regulating those custodians to make sure consumers are protected, and we very much appreciate your and Congressman Cardenas's resolution emphasizing that point. But it's also very important that people who are building the fundamental infrastructure are not swept up in a burdensome regulatory regime that isn't aimed at the risks they create because they don't take custody, because they don't actually hold other people's valuables.
That's interesting. Okay.
Are the innovations in fintech being driven predominantly by startups or by the more traditional banking institutions? And are there partnerships between the two, between startups and more traditional banking institutions? And I defer to all members of the panel.
Some very fruitful partnerships have emerged even in the open blockchain space. I think in the early days, many people believed Bitcoin was just a strange internet phenomenon, but that has radically changed as blockchains become a popular, almost buzzword in Wall Street and elsewhere. One particularly exciting partnership to highlight is a partnership between Ethereum, Zcash, and innovators at JP Morgan to build a blockchain that will be flexible for smart contracts like Ethereum's open blockchain network, that will have some privacy elements taken from the Zcash network, and that will serve potentially heavyweight enterprise-type clients.
Is there something that we should be doing here in Congress to make sure that we are preeminent in fintech?
I would say quickly that for non-custodial developers of these technologies, these open blockchain networks, the state-by-state money transmission framework is a bit of a maze to navigate.
Yes.
They are really not money transmitters. They build pipes. They don't push the water through the pipes. But they'll have to get an opinion from 53 different states and territories from the regulator in that jurisdiction that says that they're safe, and they won't be on the hook for unlicensed money transmission, which carries a $5,000 5 years in jail and potentially multi-$1,000 fines. So those are very real liabilities, and I think they frighten people away to some extent from building their infrastructure here in the U.S.
This is always a challenge regarding our dual sovereignty. What would you recommend that we do? Because we do have dual sovereignty in this country.
Yes, and I think the states have a valuable role to play as far as licensing custodians of other people's digital currency. However, I think we do need a federal safe harbor that would basically clarify the legal landscape across all the states, saying that non-custodial businesses should not need to be licensed.
Can you speak to the role the FTC can play to ensure the latter?
I'm sorry, Congressman, that was the FTC?
Yes.
Well, the FTC plays a valuable role enforcing unfair and deceptive acts and practices, somewhat mirrored by the CFPB's authority there. However, I think they play a valuable role with respect to these open blockchain networks in that many of the applications that people build on these networks will not be custodial, and as I suggested, should not therefore be regulated as money transmitters. You might then ask, okay, well, who's going to check their code as a regulator, make sure that the app does what it says, even if the money is not being held by the app designers? Unfair and deceptive acts and practices have a long track record in making sure that people build their tech right on the internet for non-financial websites, and I think the FTC can continue to play that role with respect to these new open blockchain networks.
You know, in your testimony, you also talked about digital assets outside of digital currencies, of course. Can you help us understand exactly what those digital assets could be, and help me visualize what the future looks like if this technology can develop?
Absolutely. So you can think of these things as bearer instruments, and the bearer instrument we're most familiar with is, of course, cash. It's a way of doing peer-to-peer money transfer. But there are other bearer instruments in our real world. There's tokens for a fairground, there's tickets for a concert, there's vouchers for certain goods and services that won't be used for other goods and services. One particularly exciting network that's being developed is called the Interplanetary File System, which I'm really glad I get to say here in this subcommittee. That is a decentralized cloud storage network that would allow people to just use the internet to store files without contracting with one or another company like Amazon or Dropbox. The way that the files would be stored would be encrypted for privacy, and then they'd be verifiably stored at different places by people running computers who are rewarded for providing that storage with a voucher, Filecoin, that can only be spent on buying storage.
I mean, it's incredible to comprehend.
I would simply echo the rest of the panel saying that the reduction in costs of provision of these services and potentially the reduction in costs of having robust identity in order to discover creditworthiness are things that open blockchain networks can deliver on by streamlining the pipes in between, persons, small businesses, big companies, and making trust and verifiability easier between those parties.
Very good. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Van Valkenburg, I have a blockchain company in my district in Berwyn, Pennsylvania, Alpha Point. who prior to this hearing echoed much of the details that you shared today. In fact, they're doubling the size of their team, and they expect that trend to continue. Preliminarily, I'm curious, when we talk about blockchain technology and job creation and GDP growth, is blockchain technology creating new jobs or displacing old jobs?
I think it's an excellent question. I come from a legal background, and when the term smart contract started floating around, everyone started suggesting that, well, we'll be able to get rid of the lawyers. That's great. I think the reality is that's simply either too optimistic or foolhardy. Really, what you end up seeing is retraining. A lawyer, for example, in this space should now learn how to code. They should learn how to write a contract that is not only embodied in legal terms, in written language, but also potentially embodied in computer code that runs on top of a decentralized network. So I don't think this leads to substantial job losses. I think it does lead to challenges with retraining, and I think education and efforts to make sure that people are aware of how things are changing are important to that end.
I discerned a little bit of disagreement on the panel on the issue of fintech charters. And so I first wanted to ask you this question and then open it up to those who agree, disagree, or maybe have a slightly different take. You used an interesting phrase, the issue of permissionless innovation versus responsible regulation. I think that's what you characterized it as. And I get what you're getting at, because I think there's always that tension when we're talking about innovation between making sure that regulatory barriers don't get in the way. At the same point in time, you don't want innovation to sort of take advantage of an outdated set of rules or laws that creates victims. And I think that that's what we're really focusing on when you talk about fintech charters and this issue writ large. The question that I have for you on fintech charters is, why do you think that they're needed, versus why could it not just be being a little bit additive to the existing regulatory or legal framework which already exists?
So under existing...
I mean, it's kind of a big step, I would...
Yes. Thank you, Congressman. I think under existing regulatory structures in general, if you want a unified federal regulator, you're going to need to be what we traditionally consider a bank. You're going to need to take deposits, make loans, and maybe do check paying or payments. If you don't want to do deposit taking, and maybe if you don't even want to do loans, you just want to do payments, you have no choice for a unified federal regulator. You will have to go state by state and get money transmission licensing. Now, that is a severe barrier to innovation from a permissionless innovation standpoint, because you're going to have 53 conversations across the states and territories and explain, well, in many cases, what Bitcoin is. And that is a difficult conversation to have with a state regulator.
Right.
Now, they may be on board with what you're proposing long term, but it's a lot of legwork. Now, the alternative would be, can I get one federal regulator? And I think the OCC's FinTech Charter presents an opportunity for that, because they've suggested that they're willing to charter banks or federal banks who do not do deposit taking, who only do payments or only do lending. I'd add that the controversial nature of the charter with respect to some consumer groups, I think often focuses on aggregation or preemption of state limits on interest rates. This is not an issue that we take a position on at Coin Center. We're primarily concerned with payments companies getting federal charters, not lenders.
I mean, I don't see what, you can have preemption, but it doesn't mean everything's preempted.
Precisely.
I tend to see the argument your way there.